Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer, and this is my son Lawrence. Welcome to Write Better Stories. Lawrence is back with us after a little hiatus, and hopefully he will cooperate today. But today I'm going to be talking about the big, the bad, Infinite Jest. It was only a matter of time that I talked about this book. This is basically a book that has a meme status along with the author, David Foster Wallace, and I will very likely make more videos about him in the future. Specifically his short stories I'm a big fan of, but I came across Infinite Jest the first time in 2011 because I was in my freshman year in college and I literally Googled like the best books of the last 20 years and it was #1. So I was like, good enough for me. So I read it and it had a very profound effect on me, as it does many people, but I think that I was maybe a little too inexperienced reading-wise to completely piece it together, and it's an 1,000-page book, so I did take a lot from it, and I found it very inspiring, but I ended up reading it again my senior year of college, which would have been in 2014, and I got a lot more out of it that time. But this book is pretty amazing because you routinely will think back on it and come to new conclusions and basically remember little details about it that sort of got pushed by the wayside. So today I'm not going to be talking about the plot, I'm not going to be talking about the various things that happened, the chronology. I think that stuff has really been talked about quite a bit, and I don't know if I have very much valuable to add to that, but what I wanted to talk about is the main theme that I have identified anyway within the book. And not just the theme of the book, but actually the theme of one of the Infinite Jest films within the book itself. So this is going to be full of spoilers, obviously, but I guess if you don't want to read this book, which a lot of people are in that position where they're interested in it, but they just don't have the time or energy to read an 1,000-page book, maybe do watch this video, but otherwise I would skip this one. But the main theme that I'm talking about is this kind of cryptic message that gets brought up at one point, which is the woman who kills you in this life will be your mother in the next life. So when I read that in my freshman year of college, this did not mean anything to me at all. The only thing I took from that, I was like, is he talking about like reincarnation? Is that really what this book is about? Or I also had kind of thought maybe it was just like a kind of a red herring, like just this sort of mysterious thing that himself, James Incandenza, inserted into his film as a way of confusing people or just doing something very pretentious. So then I read it again my senior year of college, and I think I got it a little bit more, but it didn't really help me at all. It didn't resonate in any way, but it wasn't until I was driving around literally a couple weeks ago that I thought of that line and a little bit more started to cohere for me. So I'm going to do my best to break down what I think that means in context of the book, and it is a multi-layered meaning. So first of all, I think that this has a lot to do with just the concept of drug addiction, which is obviously an enormous theme within the book, that these people have basically gotten themselves into this terrible situation, and I don't mean to judge drug addicts or anything like that about how they've gotten themselves into it. Basically, they're in a very terrible situation through mental illness, through many different reasons that they end up coming to abuse drugs, but then through rehab, they end up finding this odd meaning and this better aspect to their lives. And a lot of people have written and talked about how in Infinite Jest, this is sort of the uniting principle of the book, that it's such a crazy book that is very full of despair in a lot of ways, and it's very dreary, and a lot of sad characters are in it, but there is this sort of grand moralistic imperative behind the rules of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step program. So I think in some ways, basically, the fact that the woman who kills you in this life is your mother in the next life is basically drugs. Like, drugs are these things that basically chewed up and spat out all of these people, but then it also gave them an opportunity to go into rehab and to learn these tenets about how to live your life, because I don't think it's any mystery that within the book, the things that these people are learning inside of AA end up applying to not just drug use, but a general way of living your life. And one of those things in general is to sort of learn to accept cliches, which I think is very fascinating. And this is something that David Foster Wallace has written about in other works of his, including the really good one about fiction and television called E Unibus Plurum, where he talks about how the next generation of fiction writers might actually try to risk cliches rather than the postmodernists who were all ironic and crazy and not your daddy's fiction. They were people that, or like this new generation might be the type that would be more stable to offer grand moral principles as a way of responding to postmodernism. And that actually kind of neatly introduces the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is how the woman who kills you in this life is your mother in the next life also has some philosophical import too that I think is very concerned with a lot of the things that David Foster Wallace was writing about in his career, which is that basically, like I was saying within that essay, E Unibus Plurum, he wanted to advance fiction, but specifically postmodern fiction, which he was very interested in. And so I've talked a lot about on this channel about what postmodern fiction is, but just for the context of this discussion today, he didn't like that there was so much formal play, and irony was the big issue that he had with it. But because he obviously uses a lot of formal play in his writing as well, but he had this sort of antagonistic relationship with it, or this ambivalent relationship, that he was obviously very inspired by it, but he seemed to sort of try to distance himself from this work the later that he got in his career. And this is, I think, basically one of the central themes of Infinite Jest, is that you can look at the fact that himself, James Incandenza, was a very postmodern film director. And in a lot of ways, Hal has been compared to David Foster Wallace himself because he's very socially awkward and very intelligent. And metaphorically, it's as though Hal is not only inheriting this very odd world from James Orrin Incandenza, but it's David Foster Wallace inheriting this very odd mode of fiction and this very convoluted way of looking at the world from the people that influenced him as an author and as a writer. And so there is this sense of paralysis that Hal ends up experiencing that I think David Foster Wallace was trying to push through a lot of his career, that he did not just want to recapitulate the postmodern era, he wanted to end up basically pushing into something that's new. But this is one of the big issues that he was concerned with, is that since postmodernism is all about reframing things and deconstructing things and zooming out and exposing that, oh, it was all a TV screen the whole time, or different formal elements like that, one of the issues with trying to zoom out of that is you've only done again what postmodernism has already done. And so this is an issue that a lot of people have with this idea of postmodernism, is that even possible? Because if you're just redoing all of the things that postmodernism already did, but just to postmodernism, it couldn't necessarily be called a new thing. And so this is, I think, one of the things that he was talking about, was that he wanted to make sure that he was doing something that was new, that was not just rehashing the past, but also talking about how, since he was inspired and reacting to these people that wanted to do something new that wasn't just rehashing the past, then what the hell is he supposed to do? It is this odd sense of paralysis that Hal ends up dealing with, and David Foster Wallace seemed to be dealing with himself. Now, I know that seemed like a long digression, but to tie that back into that central theme of the woman who kills you in this life is your mother in the next life, is that is sort of formally and stylistically and ideologically where David Foster Wallace is within the literary canon, is that he ends up basically being somebody that was inspired by this interesting mode of expression, which is postmodern fiction, and that was the thing that maybe killed him, not in any real sense, but more metaphorically. And then there's a strong imprint of that within his fiction. But rather than trying to make Infinite Jest just another reframing, another topographical shift, as John Barth called it, that postmodernism is supposed to do because everything has already been done before, he used all of those interesting postmodern elements, but then sandwiched in the middle, as opposed to the end of the book, is this structure for living your life, these rules of Alcoholics Anonymous, these things that a lot of the more intelligent people within the program end up having a little bit difficulty wrapping their heads around, because it's not this heady thing. It's just these rules that you're supposed to follow because they work and they have utility, which is very, very different from the themes of a lot of different postmodern philosophy and postmodern fiction, which aims to basically say that there are no rules and that there is no grand uniting principle that you can live your life according to. And so, again, just to try to put a button in it, is that he was responding to this postmodern era and this postmodern style. That was the mother that killed him in this life, and then that same mother was the woman who killed him in the old life, and that ended up being his mother in the next life, that he still had a very strong relationship with this. And he actually says this more explicitly in the book in one of the more popular quotes, or one of my favorite quotes from it, and he uses this word anaclitic. So I actually pulled it up on my laptop. It's defining yourself in opposition to something as still being anaclitic on that thing, isn't it? And so, if you don't know, which I definitely didn't, anaclitic means relating to or characterized by a strong emotional dependence on another or others. So this is that issue that he felt like he was in as a writer, and also what the character Hal is sort of dealing with in the book is that he does want to define himself in opposition to this thing, but he realizes that in order to respond to postmodernism, or in Hal's case, respond to his father's situation, he still ends up sort of making that the main point of his life, or of his artistic style, that by responding to postmodernism and trying to push it forward, he ends up being dependent on that and then placing postmodernism at the center of his work. And so, again, I hope I'm making this clear, but to me, that is the sort of uniting philosophical principle of Infinite Jest, at least the theme of it. Obviously, the plot is much more complicated than that. There's all of these different things in there. But again, I think that that is the central tension and the sort of ambivalent relationship that David Foster Wallace had with his own writing and just as a person. Because I think, if anything, what you can say about his work is that there's just always all these caveats attached to everything. It's like he's so unwilling to make any one claim without attaching a bunch of different, different exchanges and different ways about how that might not apply. And there's always these little interjections. And I think that that is pretty neatly summed up with it. It's that he wants to oppose postmodernism, but then he realizes that by opposing it, that it's the biggest part of his style too. So, that's all that I think I have to say about it now. I'm trying to keep these videos shorter from now on. Also, I don't know if you noticed, my light is blue now, so I'm going to be trying to change up some different styles. I have this cool app on my phone that maybe for an emotional shift I can go, oh, you didn't think I was going to do that, did you? But then maybe if something different happens, then I'll go like that. Okay, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Write better stories.